There's a recognition of the dangers to free speech. And I'd say the other thing is that among most faculty members realize that the spirit of open inquiry is absolutely crucial to what we do. And they need to be mobilized to see that there is a threat to their environment.
This is, again, the third panel looking at the issue of campus culture and speech. And this is one of those issues. I talk a lot on college campuses and in various audiences about the issue of viewpoint diversity. The issue of campus speech is one that is, like several of the other issues that we've discussed, many layered. I think for a lot of people, when they think about campus speech, they're thinking about speakers being brought to campus and some of the protests and invitations and disinvitations that we've seen around the country. But this panel is not only going to be exploring that issue, but also looking at the experience of students and faculty on the campuses themselves and the experience of students and faculty within the classroom. In some ways, it might not seem like a logical fit that a school of public policy would care about these things, but as one that is, I think, fair to say, one of the only conservative graduate policy schools in the country, and as one that has, I've had the personal experience of going through the trials and tribulations of bringing various speakers to campus who have not been allowed to speak on other campuses. At the same time, I've also engaged with undergraduate students who have then come to the graduate policy school and learned about their experiences as conservatives or as people of faith or as progressives in some instances who frankly were not, as they would say, woke enough in the way that they express themselves in certain classroom discussions. I think it's fair to say, and we will be exploring this throughout this panel with a great diversity of speakers and representatives. The one point that I try to get across, especially to adult audiences, is that your experience as an undergraduate student, if you went to a 2 or 4 year school, and if it was, say, 20 years ago or further back, I graduated from George Washington University undergrad in 1989. Your experience, our experience as an undergraduate is significantly different than what is happening on college campuses today. And we're not just talking about the invitation, disinvitation thing that's happening. We're also talking about the experiences of students and faculty inside the classroom, in their professional work, in research and journal writing. And so this, again, is a many-faceted set of issues that I look forward to exploring. And also, as it relates to the impact of the administrative state, is one where the administrators are at a variety of different levels, both at the national level, and we'll talk about some of the federal regulations around these issues, but all the way down to the local college level with the growth of what I call the diversity academic complex. And so let's just quick introduction of our speakers. To my right, Inez Feltscher Stepman is Senior Policy Analyst for the Independent Women's Forum. To her right, Kevin Kiley is an Assemblyman representing California's 6th Assembly District. To his right, Vice President and for Legal and Judicial Strategy for Americans for Prosperity, Casey Mattox. To his right, Professor Shep Melnick, the Thomas P. O'Neill Jr. Chair and Professor of American Politics at Boston College, and also within the Morrissey College of Arts and Sciences. And to his right, Associate Professor of Government at Claremont, McKenna College, Dr. John Shields. So as a place to start, and I think this first round of as we go through this first individual set of just personal engagement with the issue, I think it will show that this set of the topic of campus speech and behavior has many different implications to it. Just a couple minutes from each of you about your work as it regards to the broader subject of campus speech and student or faculty behavior. First to you, Inez.
Sure. Well, I look at this from the policy perspective, working in ed policy and in higher education policy. And I know that a lot of my fellows up here on this panel are going to talk about, for example, that diversity academic complex, the growth of bureaucracy on university campuses, and then the growing hostility on university campuses to any kind of open inquiry or debate. I want to emphasize that all of this is underwritten by us all. Right? So we all invest in the university system, whether they're public or private, because the vast majority of universities in America depend as their lifeblood on federally backed student loans. And I think it's actually a really exciting time to start pushing on these universities and demanding something in return for that investment. Because it seems to me that that investment was made on two premises, neither of which are as true today as they were 20 years ago or 30 years ago. Mm-hmm. The first one is that we're going to invest in students going to university because they were going to raise the GDP, right? They were going to do better economically, they were going to get better jobs, make more money, pay more taxes, and that would lift all the boats. That's still true, but increasingly we're seeing there are alternative routes to success, to financial and career success. And we're having more and more difficulty sussing out from the social science whether universities are just laning people who have other advantages in life into success, or if they're actually producing that economic success. So that's more in doubt than it was 20 years ago. There's no doubt about that. And the second thing is sort of a more idealistic argument, and that's that we're producing wiser citizens. We thought education is a public good because we're producing wiser citizens who are going to be better voters, they're going to be better civic organizers, they're going to be better members of their community. I think the majority of America now laughs at that idea that universities are producing wiser, more tolerant, more engaged citizens. And so because of that, I think it's time for us to start looking at whether we want to continue this enormous public investment, or at least to tie in the subject of this panel directly, at least whether we ought to condition that money, that enormous amount of money, there's $1.6 trillion in outstanding student loans, 90% of it underwritten by the federal government, whether we ought to start conditioning those literally trillions on universities, particularly public universities, actually living up to their obligation they already have under positive federal law, and they already have under the Constitution, and I'm sure Casey will talk a lot about that, but and under state law as well. So I think it's high time we start talking about that. And I think that Americans actually agree with me. There's been a precipitous drop-off in trust in the universities as an institution just over the last 4 years. And it's easy to see how a lot of these events that you referred to, the disinvitations, the viewpoint discrimination, the bias response teams, the free speech zones, all of the settlements, the various federal settlements, how this all ties into the public perception of universities. And what we've seen is a solid bipartisan support for universities in the last 4 years. Republican independent support tumble off a cliff. And now fewer than 1 in 3 Republicans thinks the universities are actually a positive, net positive for the country. So I would behoove actually, especially all of us in academia, especially to think, that investment won't last forever if the public support doesn't last forever. And so I think that it would be wise to shore up that public support by living up to their obligations.
Make no mistake, this is a self-defense panel, right? I mean, this discussion is really about preserving, enhancing, and supporting one of America's great civic institutions, and that is higher education. And so thank you, Inez, for making that very important point. Assemblyman Kiley, you've engaged on this issue legislatively, but also just by virtue of some of the work you do, you see a lot of what's happening on college campuses, particularly here in the state of California. What has been your learning and how you've engaged on this issue?
Yeah, it's been something I've focused on, like literally from the very beginning of my time in office. It was 2 weeks after I was sworn in December 2016. The first article the Sacramento Bee ever did during my time in office started with what is a new California Assemblyman to do as one of his first official acts, perhaps accuse the local university of infringing students' First Amendment rights. So I had issued a statement after Fire put out its annual report on campus speech codes, noting the ones in California, including Sac State, which is near my district, that have policies that were deemed to be violating the First Amendment. But
And FIRE is a nonprofit that analyzes and surveys on free speech on college campuses.
That's right, Foundation for Individual Rights and Education.
Right.
So that first year, I took on the issue through a resolution which called on all of California's universities to adopt the University of Chicago Statement. I'm sure folks are familiar with the University of Chicago Statement, which is kind of the gold standard for a university free speech policy, which sets forth in a few pages of very well-written statement not only the obligation of universities to respect the First Amendment, but also to protect First Amendment rights and free speech against attempts to quash it. And that's now been adopted by dozens of universities throughout the country. But this resolution was a first of its kind resolution where the state as a whole, the legislature, would officially endorse the statement and encourage our universities to adopt it. And then we also included a similar statement from UC Irvine's Chancellor Howard Gilman to have a sort of California-specific model there as well. This all was going on sort of amidst all of these issues on college campuses hitting a real low point with the Berkeley riots in 2017, where you literally had violence being used to try to shut down an invited speaker there. So I had figured this would be a pretty heavy lift to try to get this through the legislature, but I got a Democrat co-author in Assemblymember Bill Quirk, who represents a district near Oakland. He agreed to be the joint author of the bill with me, and we ended up getting it through the legislature unanimously, both houses, the Senate and the Assembly. So that was encouraging. And then in 2018, decided to take another step and to actually do a bill that would, number one, require all of our universities to adopt the University of Chicago Statement. And then we took a somewhat different approach than some of the other free speech legislation that you see. I partnered with Chancellor Gilman, who I mentioned from UC Irvine, as well as a kind of unusual person to work with, and that's Dean Chemerinsky, Erwin Chemerinsky, who's the dean of UC Berkeley Law School, who I probably disagree with about just about everything in the world of politics, but he's actually been really good on issues of free speech. And Gilman and Chemerinsky have written a book together and have been have a free speech center associated with the UC. And so we actually wrote the bill together, myself and the two of them. I don't usually kind of write my own bills. You give that to the Legislative Counsel's office, but we wanted to get the language right on this. And our idea was, I'm a big fan of like the Goldwater Institute's model and some of these other out there, but those had been tried and had failed in our legislature. So we decided to focus on the educational component of trying to actually give students a better understanding of what the First Amendment is and why free speech is important, because it's actually a fairly counterintuitive principle in some ways. And Gilman and Chemerinsky's argument is that students have direct personal experience with what some might call the harm of speech that could some might find offensive or harm or degrading in some way, but they don't necessarily have direct experience with the harm of not having principles that are supportive of free speech and the harm of censorship. And so that's why you might have more of a tolerance for censorship among younger people at universities these days, especially when those tendencies are really reinforced by the faculty. So our idea was to teach, during orientation or as part of the curriculum on campus, the history of the First Amendment, why it's important, its role in the centerpiece of American democracy, and that sort of thing. And this bill actually got endorsed by, I was really proud of the coalition we put together. The UC system as a whole endorsed the legislation. We had several dozen Jewish American groups who endorsed it, as they rightly see the connection between, on the one hand, the trend on campuses towards repressing speech, and on the other hand, the sort of frightening resurfacing of anti-Semitism that we see on some campuses, as you have these sort of attempts to shut down speakers who are supportive of Israel or what have you. We had groups like the Slavic Chamber of Commerce, where they'd come and speak about how they came to America because they'd lived in a society where you didn't have the freedom to speak your mind and what that was like. And despite the fact that our legislature had not passed free speech bills in the past, this actually passed the Assembly Higher Education Committee, which I've been on the last 3 years unanimously. And, but bad news is it got killed in what's called the appropriations suspense file, where behind closed doors bills can be just sort of killed without a vote. So we're going to continue trying to push that forward, but at least it was encouraging that we were able to take a small step with the resolution and make some progress with this legislation. And when you look, generally speaking, there have been some somewhat positive trends in this area on campuses. For the 5th year in a row, FIRE's report has actually seen a reduction in the number of campuses that have a sort of red light warning. And I think as I said, the University of Chicago statement has been adopted by more and more universities. But then you have a lot of very troubling trends as well. So I think that just in sort of closing, I think we are at a crossroads of sorts here, where are we going to summon the political will to make reforms at universities to ensure they remain lively environments where First Amendment freedoms flourish? Or, as the topic of this panel sort of alludes to, are we going to see the culture that has existed on these campuses sort of infect our broader political culture, which will broaden the threat to freedom and the threats to the First Amendment? And I think it is vitally important that we do everything we can to choose the first course.
Casey, your engagement on this set of issues.
Well, my principal engagement on the campus free speech issue over most of my career has basically been to sue the universities that violated the First Amendment. I think my count is at about 40 different colleges that I've sued in 21 states. California has been a frequent violator, so it's allowed me many trips to California over the years. But I know when you began, you were almost kind of apologizing for the fact that there's a sort of an odd fit between this panel and the two that preceded it. So I'll push back a little bit and try to unite these. I see this as a perfect fit in 4 ways. First of all, universities are basically just executive branch agencies of state government. There are a lot of other things too. But you can't miss the fact that a public university is a branch of state government. And if you think you can miss that fact, try suing one of them and wait till the university comes back and claims sovereign immunity, and you will quickly realize that they are in fact the government. That seems to be the first time that they realize that they are the government, but they do make that fact very clear if you actually just try to sue them and take money for harming your client. So these are administrative agencies, and while there has been a lot of positive movement over the years on reforming some of these codes, 91% of universities still have either red or yellow speech codes. Now, that's been a lot more yellow than red than it has been in prior years, but you're still left with basically administrative agencies whose actual regulations affecting student speech are outside of their delegated authority. Their delegated authority being the Constitution. And that's a problem for 91% of schools. If 91% of Alabama communities suddenly decided today that they were going to enact rules that said you can't speak on the sidewalk, or if you're going to speak on the sidewalk, you have to get permission in advance from the city council to speak on the sidewalk, no one would say, well, is it really a crisis? I don't know. It seems like it's a bit of a problem, but it's not really that big of a deal. The ACLU would sue, and I would hope that everyone with a law license would jump in on that action and say this is something we've got to deal with. So the first point is these are in fact agencies. How do you get to a permission society? One way you get to a permission society is you basically send about 2/3 of people through college campuses and tell them, here's, welcome to adulthood. This is the first time you've been out of your, away from your parents. This is your first opportunity to learn how to interact with government officials. And one of the first things they tell you is, here's about a 200-page document detailing every part of your student life. And some of those rules include things like, if you want to speak, you have to get permission to speak. There are certain areas you can't speak. There are forms to fill out to be able to speak. I've even seen universities that would tell students that in order to just a group of them in a private car, if you want to leave campus and go somewhere else, if more than 3 of you are part of any student organization, doesn't have to have anything to do with anything, just you met because you were friends in the student organization, there are forms to fill out to tell the university that you're going to be leaving that campus. It shouldn't surprise us then that people start to have this mentality, this permission culture mentality when that's what you're coming through. The third way is basically just the incentives that are created. Qualified immunity, many of these issues that I think are basically unconstitutional actions that have taken away the incentives for universities to try to fix these policies. And we can perhaps get into this a little bit later, but look, if you sue universities, you get to look like Paul Clement. You always win. If you actually get to the merits, you win your case. The bad news is you almost never get to the merits because they can string this out for years, and through a number of doctrines, they will never pay. So there's no reason for them to actually fix these policies in advance. So I mentioned 91%. You would think, well, why aren't these colleges fixing these policies? Well, there's no reason for them to fix those policies because they can always fix the policy after you've sued and been in litigation for a couple of years. And taxpayers, especially in California, have paid outside counsel to litigate the case and learn how to be a lawyer. The first-year associate gets to learn how to be a lawyer on the taxpayer dime. And then the final point, we can get to this later. The final point is just obviously on the flip side of this, there are, I think, some bad ideas for how to fix this problem that are going to come with administrative overreach. And especially on the federal level, there are some concerns with some of the ideas I think that are being proposed about how to fix this from Washington that could in fact exacerbate many of the problems we're thinking about.
Thank you, Casey. Shep, you've written a book on Title IX, and at first glance, that would not seem to have speech implications, but as you've argued, this isn't just about, as it was the case when I was an undergrad, launching more women's sports teams. It's changed a lot over the last decades and does have speech implications. Wonder if you could speak about that.
Sure, thanks. I come to this issue really from two perspectives. First, as a person who's lived in the academy for now 50 years. I started off as a student radical devoted to freedom of speech, and I ended up being considered conservative, devoted to freedom of speech. I'm proud to say that I was able to defeat the Boston College Bias Incident Report Team as it applied to faculty, and I did so simply by saying, this is something all faculty should be against, and the deans agreed with us. It takes someone stepping out to indicate the problem to make any change. But as Pete has indicated, the other way I came to this was through my book on Title IX. What has Title IX got to do with free speech? Well, the key words here are sexual harassment. For, I think, good reason, the Supreme Court and other courts and the Office for Civil Rights have said that if there is systematic harassment of women, as it would be true if there was systematic harassment of African Americans or Latinos, that is a denial of equal educational opportunity. But once you came to that point, then there was the mission creep that happens in so much of regulation. The Office of Civil Rights said, well, it doesn't have to be systemic. If it's an individual case of harassment, that will be enough. So what is harassment? The Office for Civil Rights in most universities defined it as any unwelcomed conduct, including, and I love this term, verbal conduct, which we usually call speech. That can be a violation of Title IX. And if you have any question about the extent to which this can be extended, you should read Laura Kipnis's book, because she wrote an article in that hotbed of radicalism, the Chronicle of Higher Education, saying that we've gone too far in regulating sexual relations between faculty and grad students. Now, actually, I disagree with her on that, but certainly that is a legitimate point of view. For that, she was investigated twice by Northwestern University. If you want to have an example of a chilling effect on speech, that is it. Now, at the beginning of this conference, Pete mentioned James Q. Wilson and his important work on bureaucracy. He was one of my teachers, and I learned, when I was studying Title IX, I realized I'd learned two things from Jim that really helped me understand what was going on here. The first is that government regulation creates regulatory compliance units within the regulated unit that Pete was just mentioning, and that those don't disappear when the regulations disappear. I think the Obama administration was extremely clever in using their power to build up these Title IX compliance offices and making them independent of virtually everyone else in the university, giving them lots of responsibility so they have many employees. They involve training all over the university. No matter what the Trump administration does to change the regulations under Title IX, and they are going to do that, they should come out with those soon, those compliance organizations will still be there, and I will predict that at most of the universities, regulation won't change at all unless they continue to be sued and lose big damage suits brought by people who've been denied due process. So the first point was about compliance organizations. The second, and I'll close with this, is as I've been learning more and more, within these organizations, what is particularly important is professional norms. And where do those professional norms come from? What are the norms that unite the regulators and the regulated? Well, they come from professional associations, and they come from schools of education where these people are trained. And I've become more and more concerned about the extent to which there are on college campuses a large group of people who think that the teaching should not be done so much by faculty as by student administrators. And they have a very peculiar understanding of what students should be taught, which I believe is starting to change student culture in ways that will manifest itself in years to come.
I want to come back to that point in a sec, Shep, but that I hope you all heard this last point, that part of the way in which this, and again, I'll call it the diversity academic complex, one of the ways that it operates is not only engaging with students and faculty and staff through training and so on and so forth, but as has been the case increasingly, they have sought a place at the table when it comes to actual curriculum development and teaching in the classroom. And that's a whole other level of engagement in the teaching of students, not done by scholars themselves, but influenced by administrators. On that happy note, we'll go to you, Dr. Shields. John, you have co-written a really important book called Passing on the Right, which looks at the plight of conservative faculty across the country in a variety of different settings. You also have made this support and encouragement for viewpoint diversity an important part of your own teaching at Claremont and working within the Claremont college system. Tell us a little bit about how you engage with this issue around free speech.
Thanks, Pete. I appreciate it. Well, as a professor at a small liberal arts college, I actually worry a little less about bureaucrats and speech codes and the Chicago Statement of Principles, the like, and just a bit more about culture. And I think culture is something that sometimes gets a little bit lost in discussions about bureaucrats and bad regulations. At Claremont McKenna, we tweaked our speech codes. We now have a green light rating from FIRE. I'm glad we do. We've passed the Chicago Statement of Principles. But after doing those things, I'm not sure it had a big impact on classrooms, right? That is to say, I'm not sure it had some deep impact on what I would call a culture of open inquiry, right? And in a culture of open inquiry, I think that's a kind of a series of norms and habits that facilitate the collective pursuit of truth, right? So it's a lot of things that we take for granted as, as part of a civil public life, right? Like we should be civil to one another, and we should not assume that people with whom we disagree are making arguments in bad faith. So partly a kind of open discussion requires, again, certain norms that really regulates our speech. Regulation has become kind of a bad word here today. But I do think we need that kind of, our conversations need to be ordered or governed by commonly shared norms, right? So if you're worried that somebody is going to call you a racist or fascist, for expressing some reservations about affirmative action, for example, you're much more likely to self-censor, right? And you're not going to kick around those ideas. It's also, by the way, this is a culture that is fragile not just in the university, but of course in our public life, right? I don't think college students or professors are particularly bad citizens, at least compared to, our political class, right? After all, these are norms that are being violated every day, starting with our president, right? I think the second point I want to make is that, and this is a point that's been made by John Zimmerman, who's a great historian of education, and he says, he's made this sort of interesting observation. He says, look, as more and more of higher education has been brought under this bureaucratic umbrella, teaching has remained mostly outside of it in lots of ways, right? Yes, these bureaucrats have tried to regulate our classrooms through, sensitivity trainings and the like, but college classrooms have largely remained a private space, right? As professors, really, our research is the most public thing that we do, right? If I've been on panels, I don't think I've ever, trying to think back, I don't think I've ever talked about my teaching in a public way, right? It's always been research, which is the most public and professionalized thing we do. And so our teaching is mostly concealed from the prying eyes of administrators and the public. And this is a fact that's troubled social justice warriors, but also, of course, activist conservatives, like, groups like Turning Point USA. And I guess there's a lot of other things I want to respond to, but let me just say this, because I want to open things up.
Yep.
I don't think we really know a lot about how this sort of this culture of open inquiry is created and sustained. Right? I think we know very little about that, and we're just really starting to study this culture really through surveys of students and asking them things like, gee, do you feel like you can express yourself on certain kinds of issues and questions?
So just a note on that too, I think, to interject myself into this panel discussion, I think the number of surveys that we're beginning to see of student and faculty perceptions of their own ability to express themselves, but also to engage with others, are beginning to shed a light on these issues.
Yes.
Some of you may know that Pomona College, Dr. Gabrielle Starr there, who is someone I know, I think was very courageous in commissioning a study of, she actually brought in the Gallup survey organization, which, because these issues are getting so predominant, Gallup now has created its own academic survey research arm. Did a survey of Pomona College's faculty and students and found that on the first lens of how people self-describe themselves politically, 89% of Pomona College students viewed themselves as liberal or very liberal. 3% viewed themselves as moderate or conservative. That number almost directly mirrored the faculty. Now, where that moved, that can be fine, right? That can be fine. Where it became disturbing is when it moved to the next level of questions regarding whether students felt free to express themselves, and would they support the phrase that there are certain things that can be said that are off limits, that should fall under some sort of speech codes. And invariably, the self-described students who were moderate, and faculty, by the way, because again, these results almost mirrored one another. The moderate and conservative students always supported freer speech and a reduction in speech codes. And the progressive and very progressive students and faculty always supported these speech codes. Now, the same thing happened actually at Harvard, because the Harvard Crimson actually also does an annual survey of their graduating students. And it was almost the same numbers, by the way, as far as progressive students and faculty. It was somewhere in the neighborhood to 80 to 90% of Harvard's graduating class in 2019 described themselves as liberal or very liberal. But when they went to did students feel open and free to express themselves, 75% of the self-described moderate and conservative students said that they feared expressing themselves. in a campus or classroom discussion. So that leads maybe to a question for all of you, even though, again, as I think we've evidenced, you're looking at these issues in different ways and through different lenses. But it struck me that unlike the other two panels, in which I think both of the panels were right to say that some of these issues around the growth and impact of the administrative state, there were actually partners across the political spectrum in support of whether it's reduction of the administrative state in occupational licensing or land use regulation. There is a significant partisan element to this. And I'm wondering, as you think about the issue of free speech, and thinking about these two surveys I just cited, both at two great American education institutions, Pomona and Harvard, whether we can discuss these free speech issues as it relates to the student, and this also goes to their ability to associate with one another, outside of this partisan lens. So I just throw that open. Casey.
Yeah, well, so I'll push back only a little bit. I agree with you that there is certainly the partisan divide is there. I mean, the organizations that work most on campus free speech issues tend to be on the right. It's with the exception of FIRE, which is, and they will point out over and over and over again, and that people don't listen to them because they're pro-free speech. They must be on the right. If you know anyone at FIRE, you know that that's preposterous. But outside of them, it's Alliance Defending Freedom, where I used to be, Center for Academic Freedom there, Young Americans for Freedom, and YAL, and Students for Life, and all of the sort of right of center student organizations are the ones that are most active on this. All that said, so this past year, we had 100 Democratic state legislators across the country voted in support of campus free speech legislation, and that's just of the ones that actually passed. 7 states enacted campus or passed through the legislature campus free speech legislation this past year. That's the most of any year we've ever had. That's the most progress we've ever had before. And by and large, it was basically good, solid, positive legislation. And we were seeing a good number of Democrats get on board. Arkansas passed a bill that sort of covered all the issues, and there were a total of 3 people in the entire state legislature that voted against it. So it was overwhelmingly passed. Democratic governor in Louisiana signed broad campus free speech legislation. So these things can be done. ACLU, we joined Americans for Prosperity and the ACLU joined together on a campus free speech bill in Montana this past year. It unfortunately then was vetoed by the governor, who about 2 days later announced he was running for president. Whether there was any connection there, I'm not sure.
Isn't he a Claremont grad there, Jeff?
Yeah. So there is, it is possible to find that common ground, and and logically it should be very common ground.
Inez, you raised your hand on that.
Sure, yeah. I wanted to address the broader issue of culture. I think you're absolutely right to say that the speech codes are largely in response to a culture on campus. And to add to your statistics, Pew did a survey of just students in various universities, and they asked them if they self-censor, and 68% of them said they do. And then I would say an even worse number would be the Brookings Institute did a survey that's found that 1 in 5 students thinks that it's acceptable to respond to offensive speech with violence. So that's really the root of this, and I would even broaden it out further. We used to think that this kind of snowflakery or whatever would impact with the real world and go away. And once students graduated and went to jobs and had to earn a paycheck, that they would realize that this kind of culture doesn't function. What we're instead seeing, I think, is the opposite, where graduates of universities are going into a variety of white-collar professions especially, and we're starting to see the advent of woke capitalism, right, where a lot of companies, their younger employees demand the safe spaces and demand certain accommodations where they don't have to listen to anything that they think is offensive in the workplace. So we're actually seeing that reverse. We're not seeing students, sort of grow up about listening to views that they are offended about as they leave universities. They're actually, bringing that culture with them. And then broaden it even out further, I think. So I am very cognizant that the solutions, when we're talking about the public university context and we're talking about public officials and we're talking about the government, is the solutions are very, very different. The solutions are Casey, the solutions are, but when we're talking about this broader culture, I think we really have to bring in the fact that, we're the cancel culture on the internet. And a lot of folks are afraid to speak or say anything because they're afraid that something will be dug up that they said that will be taken out of context. And then even this last week with the NBA and China, right, where we see American spaces, they're private spaces, right? So the First Amendment doesn't apply, there's no question about that. They're private spaces, but we're seeing that in order to interact in a Chinese market with American companies, acquiescing to Chinese rules that are very opposite of the culture of free speech. So I think there's a broader problem here with the culture and the narrow idea of the First Amendment. The First Amendment is fantastic, and it will protect us in certain limited situations. But that will mean a lot less if we still have the majority of people who self-censor because they're afraid of being called racist or having tweets dug up, or if they're interacting in private spaces where those companies are increasingly adhering to, for example, Chinese norms about speech.
Shep, you raised your hand.
Sure. Certainly, I think the internet, social media has had a really detrimental effect on students, made them much more anxious about being ostracized. But I think there are also some signs of hope. Howard Gilman, you mentioned Howard Gilman. I've known Howard for many years, and he's kind of a standard liberal. Chemerinsky is on the left on almost everything. But in a lot of places, especially in law schools, surprisingly, given how left most law schools are, there's a recognition of the dangers to free speech. And I'd say the other thing is that among most faculty members realize that the spirit of open inquiry is absolutely crucial to what we do. And they need to be mobilized to see that there is a threat to their environment. Most of the people who benefit from that are just off doing their research and doing their teaching. They're not politically engaged. I would say that there certainly there are a number of people on the universities who are spreading the view that speech is violence. I just said that speech itself is violence, and therefore that's why you can respond to speech with violence. I think that's a very dangerous understanding, but it's very
points
common.
you just mentioned. Yeah,
Right.
Yeah. Assemblyman.
So we had a episode here in California a couple months ago on a somewhat related topic that I think is instructive to the question you asked, which is the release of the Model Ethnic Studies curriculum. I don't know, did anyone hear about this? So this was there was a bill passed in 2015, and these pass occasionally, asking the state to create a model curriculum on a subject that then can be used at schools throughout the state. And so it actually
But these
passed,
are high schools and...
Yeah, high schools, exactly.
Right.
So this bill passed in 2015 to create a model ethnic studies curriculum. It was bipartisan, and the State Board of Education then appoints a group of mostly academics to craft the curriculum. So they put out their first draft a couple of months ago, and there was quite a reaction to it. Just to give you a flavor for what it was like, the Wall Street Journal's headline, "California wants to teach your kids that capitalism is racist. A new model curriculum for ethnic studies is a handbook for classroom propagandizing." A couple excerpts. Capitalism is described as a form of power and oppression alongside patriarchy, racism, white supremacy, and ableism. The document's filled with fashionable academic jargon like positionalities, hybridities, neplantas, and misogynoir, cis heteropatriarchy, and so on and so forth. In addition, it sort of was very critical of Israel. It specifically endorsed the BDS movement and that sort of thing. So you had a lot of pushback to this from folks like me. I called it, I was interviewed by the New York Times about it, and I said it was progressive to the point of self-parody. But you also had a lot of pushback from the other side of the aisle. Governor Newsom came out and said that it was offensive in so many ways and it would never see the light of day. Linda Darling-Hammond, who's the president of the State Board of Education, rejected it. The state superintendent of public instruction, Tony Thurmond, said it was unacceptable. You had 14 Democrat legislators who make up the Jewish caucus said that it was insulting, denigrating, discriminatory, anti-Semitic, factually inaccurate, and directly contrary to established California law and policy. And they said it stemmed from a narrow political ideology and was likely to fuel hatred and discrimination. So I could go on with other such scathing comments. And I'd encourage you to read the Jewish caucus's letter because it really is amazing. But the point is that how do you have a group of academics that manages to come up with a proposal like this and think that it's perfectly okay, that is so roundly criticized by even the Democrat legislators. LA Times had an editorial shredding it in the most liberal state in the country, and I think it shows you just how far afield the culture of universities has gotten and how it is kind of a world unto itself.
But let's drill down on that for a second, because I think it goes to Shep's point. There is something about the influence of these graduate schools of education in particular, and my exposure with administrators in particular who have come out of many of these programs is I'm sure they're speaking English. I just have no idea what they're saying. And to the point of many of the items and categories that were in that particular document, which again, even the LA Times listing them out, I mean, there's a whole new set of verbiage and nomenclature which are, frankly, 0.5% of people are familiar with. But it almost just goes without any sort of response within these bubbles. I wonder if you could speak to maybe Shep and particularly John, speak to this kind of these graduate schools of education and education philosophy and their influence in this broader discussion around speech.
I'll just say something very briefly, that some of you might have seen the survey that Sam Abrams did about student affairs administrators. And turns out they're far to the left of faculty members. Why is this? And I think a lot of it has to do with what Pete was just saying, that increasingly this has become a student affairs administrator. There's a career path, and it goes through schools of education. Schools of education have always been the weak link in the American higher education system. And I think that they're more of a bubble than any other part of the university.
John, do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, not on ed schools in particular, but I have something to say about self-censorship. I mean, I think one view that's been articulated here is that, colleges and universities have this sort of illiberal culture, and our challenge is to make sure it doesn't spread to the larger society. And I think there are some things that are particularly, pathological about some universities, and certainly some parts of the university, like ed schools and ethnic studies departments, et cetera. But if you look at sort of the survey data on self-censorship, right, you'll find that actually lots of Americans self-censor, right? It's very common. University students are somewhat more likely to say that they self-censor, so there does seem to be something going on with them. And they do express somewhat more illiberal kinds of sentiments at times, right? They're somewhat more in favor of speech codes, for example. But they're not radically different, it seems to me, from the larger society. So the kind of general liberalism we see in the university, at least if we're just looking at survey data, we find in the general public as well. Now, that should be troubling because we think of the university as a place where, as a liberal institution, right? As a place where people should come and be able to sort of freely express their ideas. So there is something sort of troubling about that fact, but I don't think I don't think we should see it culturally as something radically distinct from the rest of American societies. I think a lot of the problems it has we see elsewhere.
Well, and just a quick to you, Casey, you had a great piece recently. I'm just going to quote from it at one point. So is the crisis really limited to the campus? Hardly. And so this question about chicken or the egg, are these cultural influences working their way into the campuses or vice versa or both? What are your...
Yeah, I think basically, look, if we're going to solve a free speech problem that I think is much bigger than the campus, then you have to work through campuses, because that's 2/3 of us go to college, spend 4 years there, get a basic understanding of how we're supposed to be interacting with people that come from different walks of life, have different ideas. So I don't know how we're going to fix it without working through universities. But I think there is a sort of a prevailing mindset, especially from a lot of my friends on the right, that basically universities are distinctly terrible. And everything is bad there. And they're anti-free speech, unlike the rest of us that are very pro-free speech. And that's kind of the operating mindset for a lot of people, right? Like, I have an American flag in front of my house. I love the First Amendment. I'm very pro. 40% of students say hate speech on campus shouldn't be protected. You've got all those statistics, and Inez went through several of those. 30% of Americans overall say that the First Amendment goes too far in its protections. 25% would give the president the power to shutter the news media if it's engaged in bad behavior. That was the question. So a quarter of Americans. And 50% of the general population says that universities should disinvite speakers if they will offend some part of the campus's population. So do we have that's where I don't think we have a free speech problem on campus as much as we just got a free speech problem. And universities are not doing a great job of addressing it right now, and they need to be doing a much better job of addressing it. But it's not as if, I mean, usually what I see is I see the boomers complaining about how terrible things are on college campuses, and they retweet Charlie Kirk talking about how terrible things are on college campuses, and then the very next tweet is, and those NFL players that won't salute the American flag, we should, I want them fired, right? Look, the NFL is different, it's private, but your desire to see them punished because of their expression is something that you should hold in a little bit of tension with your desire to see free speech upheld on the university campus. Hopefully I've made somebody angry.
I think that's right.
Inez.
So to push back a little bit against this we're all terrible narrative, I mean, we all are terrible, that's true. But there is a generational component to this, and why I do think that universities are, and you didn't say otherwise, universities are ground zero for this. So Gen Z, as you said, 41% believe that the hate speech should not be protected, or offensive speech should not be protected. Millennials, that's my generation, 40%, so just slightly, I mean, basically within the margin of error. And then the older you get from there, Gen X, only 27% believe that hate speech should not be protected speech, right? Boomers, 24%, silent generation, 12%. So there is a generational component to this. There is something changing over time in our culture. And we can debate the reasons for that. It's certainly a declining civic understanding of what the bedrock principles of a liberal society are, but I don't think that we can deny that this is an increasing problem, and it's not uniform throughout society. There is a difference between younger people and their elders on this.
And I totally agree. I've represented students who have literally been arrested and spent the night in jail for distributing the Constitution on their campus on Constitution Day. So I'm not here to deny.
Well, and that's why I would also
on
say
campus.
too that to the broader data, I think if I remember one of the points that you quoted, Casey, that 50% supported tighter regulations on speakers. I would love to see the crosstabs on that on partisan affiliation for those students, right? Because if you did that at Pomona, just given what we've seen already from the data that's come out of that survey, or Harvard, you would see a significant weighting towards a large percentage of students wanting and inviting these kinds of regulations, but they are tending to come from a particular side of the aisle around a certain set of issues.
Yeah, and I mean, no doubt. I mean, basically, and this is true just about everywhere, universities, obviously skew to the left, both faculty and students. But anybody with power wants to silence the people who don't have power. That's just, that goes back a few millennia or so.
And you know what, Casey? If we were having that conversation, I mean, I think that really is a powerful statement that you just made, because I see it the same way, that it doesn't necessarily need to be something inherent in the ideological leaning of students and faculty or administrators, but it does get back to some of these power dynamics and an unwillingness or an incapacity to see certain issues from a certain point of view. And campuses are notoriously bubble-like environments, and can be. I want to get to some of the questions from the audience, and here I think is a good one, and it goes, John, to your good point around culture. Question about whether university students are more interested in either regulating or unregulating speech because the university mission itself has become much more of a promise around career and economic opportunities as opposed to a truer sense of a classical liberal arts education.
Well, maybe I'm taking a slightly different angle at this than this question is sort of driving at here. But I do think that, it used to be that colleges and universities, especially when they were the elite colleges where it had a sort of religious mission, there was a sort of soul to the university. So it gave students a sense of meaning and purpose, and it wasn't just offering a kind of careerism. And I think now that it's, they've secularized, it's replaced by the market. And I think for a lot of students, they arrive at, you're 18, 19, you're looking for meaning and purpose in life, and students find it, I think, these days in social justice, right? It seems like a higher calling and purpose than Wall Street, and the intense achievement culture that seems shallow, I think, to a lot of students on college campuses. And so that makes, I think I could see why social justice movements would be really seductive in a lot of ways for young students.
Well, and I wonder too, given that this turn that's been made equating speech to violence and connected to that piece as well. I just think more broadly, culturally speaking, that has been a significant turn in how we engage with one another. And then the regulatory mechanism. I mean, what was that phrase? Verbal conduct.
Right, verbal conduct.
Verbal conduct. That's rather an Orwellian term, really, if you think about it. But Shep, you had something
Yeah,
to
I
say.
just want, I teach at the Jesuit school, and I think there is some advantage of having a religious mission, even though I'm not Catholic, but I think that there's an advantage there. Unfortunately, the Jesuit mission these days seems to be above all about social justice. So it's a two-edged sword. But I just wanted to, on the culture issue, I just want to come back to the dilemma that John raised at the beginning, which is we don't want people to self-censor, but we do want them to self-regulate, right? Yeah. We don't want them to attack people viciously. We don't want them to use racist comments. So we want to teach them how to engage in civil and serious discourse, which is a training which is often very difficult. And I've got to say that given the failure of the president to self-regulate, it's really, really difficult to teach people about the virtues of self-regulation.
Actually, to quote John Zimmerman, he's got a great line about this, which is that, he always tells the students, and I follow his example, when students ask him about Trump, he says, well, look, you can have all kinds of reasonable disagreements about tax policy, about immigration, all these sorts of issues. So you can embrace lots of Trump's policy views, you just can't act like him, which I think is right? You have to engage in sort of good faith arguments, treat people with dignity and civility, not call them names, and I think that's right. And so,
well, yeah, I was just going to say that brings in this discussion around, and I think Casey as well as Shep were leading to this earlier, about the president's executive order around free speech. It was, as many of these executive orders tend to be, extremely vague. And, but in some ways, I know for some working in this area, at least put a marker in the ground from the federal level that this was going to be a topic for discussion and exploration. And so, first looking to you, Casey, but I also want to draw in you, Kevin, thinking about things at the state level. What are the pros and cons of the president wading into this through the executive order?
So when the president announced he was going to do this executive order, the way this basically happened was the president spoke at CPAC. He apparently said off the cuff we're going to do something on campus free speech. And of course, everyone in the White House said, wait, we are? Because that seems to be how most things are actually working these days. But so they put an executive order out a couple of weeks later. There were a lot of people in the sort of free speech world who were concerned about what this was going to say. In part because, look, there are a lot of negatives that come when you start getting the apparatus of the federal government engaged on this question at the state level, some of which are bad for free speech. And I'll just give you some, a handful of examples. There was, until the executive order came out, and you're right, it basically just said the First Amendment is a thing, go do stuff accordingly.
Discuss.
That's essentially what the executive order ended up actually saying. But it was on the table for a very long time whether or not this was going to apply the same way to private and public colleges, meaning that private colleges would be told you have to afford the exact same free speech protections as a matter of federal law as public universities. It would have taken maybe 2 days for Liberty University to be defunded under that policy, and so, which may be the reason why it didn't happen. But so, I mean, there were concerns there. Even now, as we wait on the agencies to engage, look, one possibility is that the agencies, I mean, the most straightforward application is the agencies just say, if universities have policies that violate the First Amendment, then they don't get any funding, right? That's the way people kind of talk about this. If you asked me right now, if you told me, by the end of the day, to say I'm flying back tomorrow, it's a bit of a mess, don't do this. But if you asked me, to send you 1,000 examples of universities with unconstitutional written policies, by the end of the day tomorrow, I could make that happen for you. So basically, it's not as if you're picking and choosing for a few examples. It's a pretty significant problem. And if you have whole new teams of people in federal agencies that are charged with the responsibility of deciding whether or not this particular policy on this particular campus is a reasonable time, place, and manner restriction on student expression. First of all, you've got all the hiring that's going to have to happen with that. You also, what that means is we don't get the development of First Amendment doctrine because courts don't touch this. It's already difficult in many cases to get courts to actually decide First Amendment cases against universities. If every judge in the country knows that anytime I say that this speech zone is too restrictive, then that means $50 billion in Alzheimer's funding for this university is eliminated, or all of your student loans stop, including the student who's challenging it, all of that student loans,
Right.
then judges are not going to decide those cases. And so you don't have the development of First Amendment doctrine on many of these issues, which you actually need.
Inez?
So I guess I disagree with Casey on this. I agree that the executive order was basically like, the First Amendment is cool, you guys should follow it. I don't think, and I agree that we have to be careful here. We certainly don't want to create government boards that review sort of compliance of universities with certain doctrines. But the fact is that public universities are already doubly obligated under the law to uphold the First Amendment. They're obligated by you via the courts, the federal courts, and the Constitution. And then there's actually positive federal law already in the Higher Education Act that demands that public universities adhere to the First Amendment. I don't see a problem tying student loan money to an obligation that the universities already have under the law. This is not an advancement of the obligations they have. It's merely attaching a more direct consequence to them not following those obligations for the reasons that I think we talked about before, especially actually it struck me that the previous panel where Christina was talking about, it's hard to take people to court. You need somebody, you need a couple years, you need somebody like Casey, you need somebody either who's going to do it pro bono or on the basis of a nonprofit, or you need a lot of money to do it, and it requires a certain amount of investment from people that a lot of people are not going to put in. And the fact is that universities, I mean, look, just in 2018, I can think of 3 large settlements in universities in Berkeley, LA Community College, and Kellogg Community College, all of these large settlements over free speech cases. And nothing, and still, we just talked about 91% of universities have either yellow or red ratings from fire. Like, yes, that's changing very slowly, but the fact is that these odd settlements, after dragging it out through qualified immunity for 2 years, is not producing the incentive to counteract that immediate cultural incentive on campus that is pushing back against the administration, saying if you do go ahead and comply with the First Amendment, you are committing violence, right, against campus minorities. So that's why I support. I think that a direct sort of kick in the wallet is actually would provide a more immediate incentive than these dragged out court cases, even though they often are resolved in our favor on the merits.
So one quick question to Kevin, and then I want to get into our lightning round here for the last question. So a two-tier question for you, Kevin. First, did the president's executive order have any impact on your discussions at the state level? And then second, are you more hopeful for change in this particular area around free speech being led at the public universities or the private ones, at least as it relates to here in California?
Well, on the first question, I'm not sure there's been a discernible impact one way or the other as of yet. But I do see, some potential downside in that it risks it just becoming perceived as more of a partisan issue. And this is actually something that I talk with college Republicans about when I talk to them on campus, because they've been, at the forefront of these of this issue. Is that we really should try to prevent ourselves from thinking about this as just another partisan issue. It should be the vehicle by which we disagree, not just another thing we disagree about, right? In that vein, it's like when you invite speakers to campus, yes, we should defend the First Amendment right of even repugnant speech. That doesn't mean you have to invite repugnant speakers on the campus. I mean, there was a good example of this at U Chicago recently, actually, where one of the professors who's led a lot of the First Amendment activity over there had said that he would, defend the right of a student group to host some white supremacist guy or something. And so then the guy called him up and said, all right, I want to come. He's like, nope, I've actually looked at your ideas and think they have no merit and would not contribute to an academic discussion here. But then he added the caveat that if someone else invited the speaker, then yeah, of course he'd defend their right to be there. So I don't think that you should invite someone to campus just because they're, just to provoke the craziness of the other side and make these things like contests of outrage between outrage about the words of the speaker on the one hand and outrage about the activity of the protesters or rioters or whatever on the other hand. So, to the extent that having the president make such a public stand makes it seem more partisan, I think that could be potentially harmful. But it's why, in the discussion about the ethnic studies curriculum, it was actually nice to see bipartisan pushback.
Yeah.
And I think we really need to struggle to maintain that when it comes to speech policy. I don't really know, as to your question about the public versus private universities, what kind of action are you thinking as far as the private universities? Just creating cultures on campus that can be modeled?
Well, the ability for the state legislature to have an impact on those things.
Oh. So in my legislation, we've only dealt with public universities, just because the direct link to the First Amendment is there.
Right. Right.
Yeah,
Well,
to be clear, I was only referring to public universities as well that are obligated under law. Just
Right.
want to be clear about that.
right. And I think that's an important lens to look at this set of issues as well. We are up against the clock, and so this is going to be the lightning round question. And John, I'm going to come to you first, so be ready for this. So the question is, we are doing this panel again in 5 years. Do we think that some of the issues that we've been discussing here, and you can choose any lens through which you want to look at it, even your own lens as it pertains to, say, viewpoint diversity or these cultures of inquiry in your case, John, do you think that we are in a better or more challenging place as it relates to these issues of free speech, inquiry, and association on campuses?
Well, that's a great question. I think, well, first of all, who knows, right? Because we're social scientists.
Nobody's going to be held to these answers.
We struggle to make sense of the past, and we're bad at predicting the future. I will say that I'm encouraged by some of the developments, right? So I'm encouraged by the success of Heterodox Academy. by some of the legislative success that's been bipartisan. I'm actually encouraged by the fact that I think that there's something really powerful about the liberal tradition in the United States. I mean, you talked, Pete, about it being in our DNA, I think, in the opening. And I see this in my students. I mean, most of my students don't like PC culture. They don't like having to self-censor. And most of my colleagues don't like it either. There is a small and powerful identitarian left. Its power varies a lot by campus, right? So when I look across the street at Scripps College, if you want to ask me what the future of Scripps College is in 5 years, I will say it's bad, right? It seems to be sliding down a hill. So I think some institutions, I think one thing this debate has done is it's really forced institutions to really think about where they want to plant their flag, right? And so some, like Claremont McKenna, I'm very happy to say, has planted its flag on the, on the hill of John Stuart Mill, and we're doing things institutionally, I think, to really deepen, I think, a culture of open inquiry that's really healthy there. I think others are going in a different direction, and they are very intentionally want to become social justice university. By the way, that doesn't bother me on some level, especially among private institutions, right? If we have a world in which a lot of private institutions want to say, hey, we are social justice university, and we've got this whole core curriculum, and you're going to read a bunch of leftists, fine, right? They should be able to go that direction. So that future doesn't bother me so much, Pete.
Shep.
I guess I'd start off quoting James Q. Wilson again, who said that political scientists shouldn't try to predict the future. We have enough trouble trying to predict the past. So I will, but I too am a bit optimistic because I think that there are a number of small things that are happening that will add up. For example, a number of professors have put together a petition to have U.S. News and World Report put a free speech rating into their U.S. News and World Report rating. That can mobilize people, I think. We will have some universities like Oberlin or Scripps. Some of those might get sued out of existence, as seems to be happening to Oberlin. The one thing I just close with saying that we shouldn't look to the federal government to do this. I'm echoing what a number of people have said. That, for one thing, by the way, funding termination almost never happens. The number of funding terminations under Title IX since 1972 has been precisely 0. So that doesn't work too well. I'd say the first thing to remember at the federal level is first, do no harm. And there are things that we could do to improve the situation. For example, there are regulations under civil rights law of anti-bullying that can be read extremely broadly. And I think if one step is to eliminate those.
Great, Casey.
So you caught me in a good year. I'm a Virginia fan. I'm a Nats fan. So yes, everything is going to be great.
Yes.
So no, I think a few things. First of all, I think the states that are getting engaged with useful, productive, positive legislation that deals with the things that they can deal with, and I think that's a big positive, and we're seeing a lot of movement in that space. I think the two things that I would hope we would see more of over the next 5 years that I think would actually make the difference. One is basically market solutions, to some degree reflects this. Whenever I talk to mostly conservative students who are passionate free speech warriors, and they're fired up about free speech on their campus, and they've all got their bad stories, and they're ready to go to defend the Constitution and liberty. And I asked them, how many of you were looked up, were aware of the free speech policies on your campus before you sent them the check and told them that you were coming there? And virtually none of them considered that at all. Was not part of the calculus at all. And then they get to their campus and suddenly found out, wait, UC Berkeley is actually not great, and I thought it was. And that's the opportunity. Now, granted, that means a little bit of sifting, and that can be bad, right? If the 89.3 number maybe becomes a bit more normal. But I think, at least in the short term, it can be a good thing if people say, look, I'm looking for the kind of college that affords me free speech rights. I want to be able to start student organizations and not have to deal with an oppressive government bureaucracy. And it provides an opportunity for some colleges to say, we can do that. And between these two options, I'll go to University of Chicago over Harvard, because I now have, so I think basically providing people with some tools that allow them to be able to see, to really make some comparisons between schools on some of these questions and why that matters to them. The other thing I think is, we can talk about this over beers.
Yes.
Qualified immunity needs to end. If you're talking about hitting people in the pocketbook and actually seeing change happen, I'm less concerned with hitting the university itself in the pocketbook and more concerned with telling administrators that, look, after the third time that you have made a decision that you're not going to allow this student group to exist on your campus because you don't like them and you don't like their beliefs, this is going to cost you. This personally affects you. And so you'd better get some training on how the First Amendment works. And your university general counsel had better make sure that they're doing some training on how the First Amendment works, because it's actually part of your job. This is a conversation that normally happens in criminal justice arenas. Qualified immunity is, in my view, the biggest problem. It's the reason why 91% of colleges continue to have bad policies, because there's no reason for them to fix that until they get sued.
Assemblyman.
I'd echo what's been said. I'm encouraged by the somewhat limited but still significant recent progress, and I think that in some sense it's a testament to the durability and power of American institutions that you've had legal channels and political channels used to push back against the sad state of freedom of speech on college campuses. And I think when you look throughout American history, there are all kinds of ignominious moments where freedom of speech is threatened. And as you said, it's sort of a natural human tendency for those who have power to try to suppress dissent, and for those who hear something they don't like, to make it stop. And freedom of speech as a principle is, in that sense, counterintuitive. And so it's part of the genius of our system is there are strong guardrails that were built in against that. And I think that what we're seeing now, as we've seen before, is that when those guardrails start to slip, as they have in higher education, we're seeing a movement to get it back in place. And so I'm optimistic that will continue, though I'm sure there'll be many struggles ahead.
Inez.
I think I'm optimistic on the law, and to Casey's point, there was an encouraging decision regarding the University of Iowa and administrators there who had repeatedly violated the rights of student groups or students that are engaged in student groups. So optimistic there. I'm much more pessimistic about the culture. Obviously, I think I'm maybe more pessimistic than the rest of this panel on that cultural question. But I think as long as free speech requires extraordinary courage, we're going to continue not to be able to have the kind of conversations that are necessary for self-government. And I think that that's a really, really terrible problem, and I don't see it getting better in the next 5 years.
Please join me in thanking our panel. Well, that wraps up this afternoon's set of conversations. I want to thank Tim Sandifer for just kicking us off, just flying, and thank you so much for your work and for all the panelists who participated. Again, I really want to thank Howard Amundsen and Fieldstead and Company for their support of conversations like this. One of the phrases that we say is at Pepperdine is that you see public policy differently from here, and that's not just a kind of a reference to our beautiful views of the Pacific. It's also our views on public policy and public leadership. Again, and to return back to the person who in many ways started this discussion, who is James Q. Wilson, these issues around the administrative state are the essential and foundational issues of our republic. And how we will get along with each other, how we will communicate and deliberate over issues that have any sort of controversy or disagreement is really going to determine what the next decades look like in this country. And I agree with you, Inez, that these are not just issues seen through a legal context. These are ones that are cultural as well. And if we're not able to get this culture of inquiry, as you've called it, I think, well, John, if we can't get this right on the college campus, heaven help us as we look out across business and politics and a whole host of other institutions in the country. So again, I want to thank you, Howard, for making this set of conversations possible. We are videotaping this, as you all know, and are excited about promoting these panels and the conversations that have happened. And I hope you will all join us now out on the patio there for a post-event reception. Thanks so much for coming and participating.